आपको मुबारकबाद देना चाह रहा था मैं। अभी शुरू हो रहा था, स्कूल इधर आना नहीं हुआ।
whole point was not to say that. क्योंकि जो उनकी
खिलाऊं क्या? कल परसों ठीक है।
Let us welcome Shunyaji and Professor Holmes. Flowers. Madam. I think the next is lighting the lamp and gathering. Srimati Gandhi, chief guest for the function, Professor Holmes, distinguished guest, Rector Professor Khan, fellow academic colleagues and friends. I have great pleasure in welcoming you here today. Today is a significant day in the history of the country, the birthday of the first Prime Minister of India, Pandit Jawaharlal. It may not be an exaggeration if I say the university owes much to the Nehru family. When Srimati Indira Gandhi was the Prime Minister, by an act of Parliament, the university was established and named after Pandit Nehru. Madam Indira Gandhi was the first Chancellor of the university. Thereafter, we have such eminent persons as Chancellors, such as late Sri Morarji Desai, late Professor T.S. Kothari, Sri T.N. Haksha, and currently Professor M.S. Gore. Madam Indira Gandhi was not only the Chancellor of the university, but in the mid-80s, when the university was to move to the permanent location, the university was given by her administration sizable funds for construction of buildings and development of other infrastructural facilities. It may not be out of place here to say we would have not reached the current stage, but for Madam Gandhiji's personal interest in the affairs of the university. When Sri Rajiv Gandhiji took over as a Prime Minister of India, he gathered such eminent personalities to draw up programs to take the country to 21st century, keeping India's cultural heritage in mind. JNU is striving to achieve Rajiv Gandhi's vision of India, his vision for the information technology, like telecommunication, computer facilities for the whole country, health, water and electricity, and other been endowed by HID Ministry as an initiative of the Rajiv Gandhi Foundation. Professor Holmes is the first chairholder. Professor Holmes has a wide reputation of expertise in the philosophy of war and non-violence. His appointment has a special significance in the context of India's assertion of nuclear capabilities and its historic contribution to the philosophy and practice of non-violence. The subject of Professor Holmes' inaugural lecture is the future of non-violence in the 21st century. Madam, we are really happy that within your busy schedule, with your university, so we have agreed to come as a chief guest. So I request you please to give your address without voice.
आगे लगाइए कल में यार इतना क्या
Vice Chancellor Dr. Ashish Dutta, Professor Robert Lawrence, respected members of the faculty, scholars of Jawaharlal Nehru University, ladies and gentlemen, friends, it is a very special privilege for me to join you at the inauguration of the Rajiv Gandhi Chair for Peace and Disarmament in this leading university of our country. Members of my family, Jawaharlal Nehru, Indira Gandhi, and my husband were closely associated and practiced relating to international relations and independent India's links with the international system. From the days of the Asian Relations Conference held at New Delhi at the initiative of Jawaharlal Nehru. The JNU has inherited and in its turn helped to expand and strengthen this tradition of search for independent, new approaches to the diverse problems of international relations. Rajiv Gandhi has himself lent support to the idea of this university strengthening the dimensions of its peace-related studies. Disarmament, and especially the elimination of nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction, were a passion with him. Therefore, Mr. Vice Chancellor, the establishment of this chair of peace and disarmament and the linking of his memories with it are a matter of deep personal gratification for me. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you, Vice Chancellor, and your colleagues most warmly for this initiative. May I also join in extending a warm welcome to Professor Robert Lawrence, whom, as the first occupant of the JNU Rajiv Gandhi Chair for Peace and Disarmament. The presence of this eminent American scholar and philosopher in the midst of India's academic elite will, I am sure, go some way in bridging the gap between Indian and American thinking on questions of disarmament and peace, so vital to human survival and the further advancement of human civilization. Ever since independence, disarmament has been at the core of India's foreign and security policy. We have always regarded nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction as a menace to human civilization and to the security of the world as a whole. We have, therefore, steadfastly sought the removal of this menace through the universal elimination of nuclear arms. We consider this an achievable goal, not in some dim or distant future, but in a foreseeable span of time of 15 or 20 years. leader. In 1988, Rajiv Gandhi presented to the UN General Assembly a detailed phased action plan for ushering in a nuclear weapon-free and non-violent address in his address in 1988. I quote, "We must ensure that the emerging order addresses itself to the concerns, the development and future of a vast segment of the international community, and that it is not a task which can be left to a small directorate of power, however strong or influential they might be," unquote. In my view, there is only one way of arresting these listening friends. Sincere adieu and great success. Thank you.
Now I request Professor Holmes to give his inaugural address.
Thank you, and ladies and gentlemen. When Martin Luther King Jr. arrived in New Delhi in 1959 at the invitation of Prime Minister Nehru, he said, "To other countries I may go as a tourist, but to India I come as a pilgrim." It's in that same spirit that I stand before you today, honored to be in a land whose culture and civilization I've long admired, honored to be associated with a university named after one of India's founding fathers, and honored to hold a chair named after one of the distinguished sons and leaders of India by birth. When I told Arun Gandhi, the grandson of Mahatma Gandhi, and you may or may not know, Arun Gandhi has established a Gandhi Institute for Nonviolence in the United States. We've become close friends. And when I told him that I was coming to India, it dawned on me that there was a certain irony that he, an Indian, was in America promoting nonviolence, while I, an American, was about to go to India to do the same. This led me to reflect upon the unexpected ways in which nonviolence has expressed itself. And I remembered a passage from Martin Luther King's biography by Lerone Bennett. Describing King's early acquaintance with the thought of Gandhi, Bennett writes, and I quote, "The Gandhian philosophy, which King considered briefly at this early juncture in his life, was far from alien. Gandhi himself was deeply influenced by Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau, in turn, had been influenced by the Bhagavad Gita and other sacred texts of the East." And then, Bennett continues, "By an extraordinary turn of fate, King would later rekindle on American soil a doctrine that had crossed and recrossed the seas in a remarkable cross-pollination of ideas." So it's in that spirit as well that I come to facilitate a cross-pollination of ideas on nonviolence. Not to preach nonviolence, which, as Gandhi saw, is largely futile and possibly even counterproductive, but rather to listen, learn, and share some of my own thinking of humankind. With the advent of the nuclear age, combined with the refinement of chemical and biological weapons, we confront for the first time the possibility of the destruction of civilization itself, possibly, in the worst-case scenarios, of the elimination of human life. Not by natural catastrophe, but by human hands, and by objects of human design, created deliberately for the purpose of trying to ensure security by threatening and, if necessary, inflicting massive death and destruction upon others. If ever the concept of alienation had been before, and we become desensitized to the message, but that doesn't alter its truth. Indeed, the psychological mechanisms by which we adjust to situations that worsen gradually by small increments may not serve us well in this area. It's been said that if you place a frog in a pail of water and heat the water very slowly, the frog adjusts to the increased temperature until imperceptibly a threshold is passed beyond which he's no longer able to jump out of the pail. Which he could Tolstoy, Gandhi, King, Mother Teresa, as well as countless unheralded persons embodying the spirit of nonviolence. Last year, 23 Nobel Peace Prize laureates, joined by Arun Gandhi and others, proposed that the UN General Assembly declare the first decade of the 21st century a decade for a culture of nonviolence for the children of the world. Among other things, the proposal invites each member state to take, and I quote now, necessary steps so that the principles of nonviolence be taught at every level in their society, including the educational institutions, focusing on the practical meaning and benefits of nonviolence in their life. The Indian ambassador to the UN has been requested to introduce the proposal next month, December. I would enlarge upon that proposal to urge that all of us, not just the General Assembly of the UN, dedicate ourselves to embarking upon not a decade or a century, but a millennium of nonviolence. We've seen what several 100,000 years of violence can produce, and we can surely foresee that we cannot go on for several thousand more years as we have in the 20th century. Either something must change, and change radically, or, like the frog in the pail, we may one day find that it's simply too late. Let us see what 1,000 years of nonviolence might bring, and of central concern. It is states whose interests, honor, and survival are the focus, as though they were Olympian gods playing out their affairs in a grand spectacle to which we mere mortals are subordinate. Second, this perspective is one of so-called realism, in which morality, if it plays any role at all, is subsidiary to national interest or to the exigencies of power politics, in which even to introduce the notions of right and wrong into the discussion is taken as a dead giveaway that one doesn't know the rules of the game. Third, this perspective defines what shall be the highest values in promoting and safeguarding national interests. Among them, sovereignty, as that entitlement by which the collectivity can do virtually as it pleases without interference by others, so long as it extends a like freedom to others. Other states, that is. Prestige is that quality conferred by the envy, awe, admiration, or respect of other states. And power, understood partly in economic and political terms, but defined ultimately in military terms, as the capacity to threaten, and again, when necessary, to inflict death and destruction on a large scale. That's what military power is. The options that are presumed to be open to us in the 21st century are defined by this perspective. This holds true on the international level and in less direct ways on the domestic level as well. Domestic values are held hostage to the values of power politics. The interest of individual persons and communities hostage to the interest of states. Thus, the pages of journals on international affairs are filling with the discussion and debate over whether the New World Order is or will be or ought to be a unipolar world with one superpower, namely the United States, calling the shots, or a multipolar world with a plurality of powers or centers of power. All of these permutations meant, of course, to replace the bipolar world defined through much of the 20th century by the agendas of the superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Insofar as any hint of moral consideration enters into these analyses, it's only by way of raising questions of fairness and consistency in the relations among states, particularly between the haves and have-nots, the nuclear and the non-nuclear. This latter fact shouldn't be surprising, of course. In a prescient observation in the closing days of World War II, as the imminent victors prepared to meet in a conference that eventuated in the forming and adoption of the Charter of the United Nations, Gandhi said, and I quote, "Exploitation and domination of one nation over another can have no place in a world striving to put an end to all wars. It is only in such a world that the militarily weaker nations will be free from the fear of intimidation or exploitation at the hands of stronger nations." And that's what we find in today's world. One finds confirmation of it, indeed, in some of the explanations of the Indian government's recent renewed testing of nuclear devices. Understandably bristling at the self-serving moralizing by the nuclear powers, who would deny to militarily weaker nations the very devices they cling to for security themselves, India's defense minister, George Fernandez, put the question of fairness clearly in his rhetorical question to President Clinton. And I quote, he asked, "Why is it that you feel yourself so close to China that you can trust China with nuclear weapons, just as you can trust yourselves with nuclear weapons, and you can trust the Russians and the French and the British, but you cannot trust India?" But it must be realized, however, that these analyses, and as I say, there are many permutations of this question of consistency and fairness and so forth, but what must be realized that these analyses crafted in the 20th century, largely after World War II. And so long as we persist in seeing the world through those lenses, there's no room for nonviolence, other than as an idealistic but impractical vision that we can admire from afar as the examples of Gandhi and King and Mother Teresa recede farther into the past. The options that are defined by the dominant perspective don't include nonviolence. The governing categories of balance of power, nuclear deterrence, national security, and national interest, as typically defined, don't allow it. Insofar as our thinking continues to be governed by this perspective, it's naive to expect that we can avoid perpetuating the trail of blood that is left through the 3,000 or so years of recorded history. A trail strewn increasingly in the 20th century with the bodies of civilians, and with a record of misjudgments by state leaders about the efficacy of war. We easily overlook the mounting historical evidence of the inability of men accurately to assess the outcomes of the resort to violence. In fact, every time there is a war, one side wins, one side loses, so violence has failed, just as violence has succeeded. So at best, violence succeeds at most half the time. The Kaiser thought World War I would be over in 6 months. The Allied nations thought that same war would end all wars. Hitler thought the invasion of Poland would inaugurate the beginning of a new world order. So-called advisors of Vietnam in the early 1960s would forestall a communist takeover. More recently, Saddam Hussein thought a swift military strike into Kuwait would establish Iraq's dominance of the Persian Gulf region. And President George Bush thought a massive U.S.-led military response would safeguard Western economic interests in the region and win one for democracy as well. Far from being over in 6 months, World War I ground on for 5 devastating years, and far from ending all wars, it led so directly into World War II that the Second War could plausibly be regarded as but the final phase of the first, just as the Vietnam War was later to be the final phase of the Indochina War. Hitler's Third Reich, of course, was in ruins by 1945, and by 1973, not only had American troops not come home from Vietnam by Christmas of 1965, as Defense Secretary McNamara had predicted, the United States, one of the world superpowers, had suffered an ignominious defeat at the hands of a small and militarily weaker nation. Not only were strategists wrong about the capacity of the U.S. to win the conflict, they were wrong as well about what the consequences of defeat would be. There was no so-called domino effect in which communism swept over Asia. That's what we heard back in the 1960s, establishing Chinese hegemony throughout the region. Vietnam today remains an independent state. Its border disputes with China belie the equally mistaken view, Western view, during the Vietnam War, that Vietnam was little more than a puppet regime of China. In fact, there was one point during the Vietnam War when it was said that the United States was within about 3 months of going to war over China because of Vietnam. Saddam Hussein had scarcely time to redraw Iraqi maps to include Kuwait when he was driven out. But on the other hand, the overwhelming military victory of the predominantly U.S. forces in the conflict led to an outcome that to date is so indecisive as to have led Margaret Thatcher to ask who actually won the Persian Gulf War. And that's relevant, I think, at this moment when the United States is preparing for another possible military strike against Iraq. Not only does Saddam Hussein remain in power, but the military foothold the U.S. has established in the Gulf region has led to a virtual declaration of terrorist war against the U.S. by Osama bin Laden, redirecting against the United States the very forces the U.S. helped arm and train against the Soviets in Afghanistan. In the United States, people, they make a great issue over bin Laden and his terrorist manifesto against the United States, but they almost never mention that there's a basis for this so-called terrorist war that he's intending to launch, and it's U.S. presence in the Persian Gulf, and particularly in Saudi Arabia, the Holy Land. And that was one of the objectives of the United States in the Persian Gulf, was to get a military foothold in that region. But we don't pay attention to that aspect of U.S. policy. The point is, I'm speaking here of the misjudgments by world leaders, and I've spoken only of a few of the more obvious, more glaring misjudgments in the 20th century. You could go back through history and continue on for practically as long as you want. The point, as Tolstoy saw, was that wars tend to unleash forces of such complexity that their outcomes are rarely foreseeable by those who initiate them. And almost invariably, as Gandhi saw, confirm anew that violence begets violence. This suggests that it's not just the violence of the 20th century with which we must reckon, but also the repeated misjudgments of world leaders arising from the limitations of human knowledge. If we're to take seriously the creation of a nonviolent world with a new millennium, we need a reconceptualization of the way in which we view the world. The problem is as much with perception as with reality, with narrowness of vision as with evil design. This means that calls for a decade of nonviolence, much less for what I would urge a millennium of nonviolence, will largely fall on deaf ears unless we open our minds to different ways of thinking about the world, our place in it, and our relations to others. Unless we undertake a Copernican revolution, if you like, in our moral thinking. If a nonviolent world is possible, we'll never know it unless we open our minds to it, free our imaginations to visualize it, and bend our efforts to bringing it into existence. Perhaps it's useful here to reflect back upon another legacy of the 20th century, spaceflight. It was just after the turn of the century in 1903 that the Wright brothers flew the first airplane. That modest beginning has, in less than 100 years, brief moment by historical terms, less than 100 years led with breathtaking speed to jetliners and travels in outer space. Now, suppose that you had lived at the turn of the 19th century to the 20th and had fallen asleep and, like Rip Van Winkle, awoken, say, in 1998. Now, suppose then that you were taken to an airport and shown a 747 jetliner and told that it could fly in the air and carry with it hundreds of passengers. You'd be incredulous, decidedly, that this hulking object made of metal and rubber and plastic, which you wouldn't have known, this object so heavy that 100 men couldn't lift it, could take off from the ground and fly through the air at tremendous speeds, would defy belief. Yet we now know that through an understanding of the laws of physics and the principles of engineering, it's possible to construct such an amazing... Our understanding of it is still in its infancy. Just as one must understand the principles of physics to understand how a plane can fly, so we must understand the principles of nonviolence to understand how it can work. And that understanding can come only through the same kind of effort, time, determination, and trial and error that is taken to make air travel a reality. Air travel was one of the progressive marvels of the 20th century in scientific and engineering realm. Nonviolence could be one of the marvels of the 21st century in the moral realm. But it's up to us to make it so. Now, to that end, it's important that we begin by no longer demonizing those peoples and nations with which we disagree. We are all, more or less, part of the problem. The good and the bad alike among nations and peoples are capable of leaving disruption in their wake and their governed by fear and insecurity. Indeed, the problems of the world probably owe as much, and possibly even more, to people with good intentions as to people with bad intentions. Next, let us try to conceptualize as nonviolence much of what is already before our eyes. If we do, we'll quickly come to see that most people are nonviolent most of the time, indeed that completely, even more completely, as an abstract entity, as states are, without a shot being fired. Similarly, the changes that swept Eastern Europe in the past decade in the Baltics, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, were by and large nonviolent revolutions, as was the transformation of South Africa from an oppressive state governed by apartheid to a democracy, and as was the overthrow of the Marcos regime in the Philippines. These were all essentially nonviolent revolutions. Third, let us end our fixation upon collectivities like the state as the entities of greatest importance in the world and elevate to a position of highest importance the persons who make up those collectivities. We can perhaps see this again in the case of the Soviet Union. Although most of its people's losses in World War I were under the Tsarist regime, the Soviet Union fought a civil war shortly after its creation, then sacrificed up to 30 million of its people, those are the estimates, in the attempt to realize its vision of social good under Stalin's collectivization. Then the Soviet Union lost another estimated 20 million lives in World War II. Yet the Soviet state endured throughout this period. That is, the collectivity continued in existence. Tens of millions of its people died, but it survived. Then in the 1990s, Soviet republics began seceding from the Union to the point where when Russia, the central and dominant republic of the Soviet Union, seceded under Boris Yeltsin, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Not a single life was lost in the process. People were killed in Chechnya later on, and that was a subsequent problem. Yet the Soviet Union as a nation state vanished. No one died, but the state went out of existence. Now, who in his right mind would argue that it's better to sacrifice tens of millions of living, breathing human beings in order to preserve the existence of an abstract entity like the state, than to allow a state to go out of existence if, in so doing, one preserves the beings whose existence gives the state whatever value it may plausibly be thought to possess. Individual persons are precious. Abstract entities are not, however invested they may be with symbolic significance. It must cease to be a decisive claim in support of a policy that is in some country or the other's national interest. That's the quote. Marx sought to shift the emphasis away from states to classes. Henry David Thoreau sought to shift it from the state to the individual. Gandhi sought to shift it from the state to small communities. States are a relatively recent development in the evolution of civilization. They aren't sacred, and we must be prepared to consider whether different ways of organizing human affairs may be better than the forms they represent. Fourth, we must recognize, try to understand, and seek ways to build upon the successes that nonviolence has had in the world, not least of all by Gandhi in this country and by Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States. Now, cynics reply, of course, that the British were nice people and America was a democracy, and that nonviolence wouldn't have worked against Nazi Germany or against the Soviet Union. But of course, nonviolence did work against the Nazis, to be sure, in limited and partial ways, when the school teachers in occupied Norway refused to join the Nazi Union, forcing the Quisling government to back down from its demands. And it worked against the Soviet Union, when tiny Lithuania, the smallest of the Soviet republics, became the first of the republics to declare its independence. Like a tiny dog standing on its hind legs, it defied the Russian bear and eventually prevailed. I happened to be in Vilnius, Lithuania, on 1 year following the 1 year to the day from the date that Lithuania declared its independence from the Soviet Union. And of course, the Soviet Union was still in existence. But it was quite a thing to behold. The Lithuanians had their own parliament. They had elected officials. People came from all over the country. Surrounding the Parliament building, they built little sheds and had fires burning in there, and they would sing songs and so forth. And they had an unarmed group of volunteers who would march without weapons and so forth, prepared to defend their government and their country nonviolently. They resorted to nonviolence. I was fortunate enough to have an extensive meeting with the Lithuanian defense minister. And I thought it would be one of those perfunctory meetings in which officials greet an academic and talk pleasantly for 5 minutes and then leave. But no, he sat me down, called in someone to take notes, and he wanted to discuss nonviolence and nonviolent ways of resisting the Soviets. He knew that it would be disastrous for Lithuania to try to use arms against the Soviet Union, but he knew that nonviolence possessed a latent power, and he wanted to exploit